Imagine Europe in the early 1900s. It wasn't a peaceful, happy continent. It was more like a room filled with gunpowder just waiting for a single spark. This was a time of immense pride and rivalry. Britain, France, Germany, Austria-Hungary, Russia, they were competing for colonies across the globe, building up their economies and flexing their military muscles. This intense competition created a web of suspicion and tension. It was a dangerous game of international chess. Germany was building a huge navy to challenge Britain's dominance. Britain poured money into building the famous dreadnoughts. On land, armies were growing at an alarming rate. To feel more secure, countries formed complex alliances. Finally, there was the powerful force of nationalism, especially in the volatile Balkan region, often called the powder keg of Europe. That desire for self-determination created constant instability and challenged the ruling powers. The date is 28th June 1914. It's a hot summer's day in Sarajevo, Bosnia, recently annexed by Austro-Hungary. Archduke Franz Ferdinand and his wife Sophie are visiting. For many Serbs, this is a provocation. They despise Austro-Hungarian rule. A small group of young Serbian nationalists, the Black Hand, plan a violent statement. They're armed with bombs. They're also carrying pistols, waiting along the motorcade route, determined to assassinate him. The morning is chaotic. The first assassination attempt fails spectacularly. A conspirator throws a bomb at the royal car. It bounces off. It explodes under the vehicle behind, injuring people. The Archduke and Sophie are shaken but unharmed. After a stop at Town Hall, Franz Ferdinand decides to visit the injured officers. The driver isn't clearly told. The convoy follows the original route. The driver makes a wrong turn onto a side street. By sheer coincidence, the car stops in front of Gavrilo Princip. Princip is outside a delicatessen, thinking it's over. He steps forward, draws his pistol, and fires 2 point-blank shots. Sophie is hit in the abdomen. Franz Ferdinand is hit in the neck. Within minutes, both are dead. The declaration of war by Austria-Hungary on Serbia triggered the tangled web of alliances. Russia, seeing itself as the protector of the Slavic people, including the Serbs, began to mobilize its vast army to support Serbia. Germany, allied with Austria-Hungary, saw this as a direct threat. They demanded that Russia stand down. When Russia refused, Germany declared war on Russia on 1st August. Now, France, Russia's ally, was drawn in. Germany had a long-standing plan for this exact scenario, the Schlieffen Plan. It called for a rapid, overwhelming attack on France first, knocking them out of the war quickly, before turning to deal with the slower mobilizing Russian army in the east. To attack France quickly, the Schlieffen Plan required the German army to march through neutral Belgium. The Germans demanded free passage, but the Belgians bravely refused. On 4th August, German troops crossed the border into Belgium, violating a treaty that had guaranteed Belgian neutrality for over 70 years. This act was the final straw for Great Britain. Britain had signed that treaty and could not stand by while a major power invaded a small neutral nation. That same day, Britain declared war on Germany. The guns of August had begun to fire. The German army smashed through Belgium and swept into northern France, pushing the French and the small British expeditionary force back towards Paris. In what became known as the Miracle of the Marne, they launched a desperate counterattack. They halted the German advance just a few dozen miles from Paris, saving the capital and shattering Germany's hopes of a quick victory. The war of movement was over. After the race to the sea ended in a stalemate in late 1914, the armies on the Western Front did something new on a massive scale. They began to dig. From the coast of Belgium to the border of Switzerland, a vast and complex network of trenches was excavated. It was an elaborate system of frontline trenches, support trenches, communication trenches. All were protected by barbed wire machine gun posts and artillery positions. The spade became as important a tool for the soldier as his rifle. Life in these trenches was appalling. Soldiers lived in a world of mud, water, and constant fear. The trenches were often waterlogged, especially during the wet winters, leading to a horrible condition known as trench foot, which could result in gangrene and amputation. Men shared their cramped living space with millions of rats, which feasted on leftover food and, gruesomely, on the bodies of the dead. Lice were another constant torment, causing intense itching and a disease called trench fever. Attacking the enemy's trench was a near-suicidal task. It meant climbing over the top out of your own trench and advancing across no man's land, the shell-pocked, churned-up ground between the opposing lines. Here, soldiers were completely exposed to machine gun fire which could cut down hundreds of men in minutes, as well as artillery bombardments and rifle fire. The generals struggled to adapt to this new reality, repeatedly ordering massive frontal assaults that resulted in catastrophic casualties for very little, if any, territorial gain. The war became a grim contest of attrition. With the Western Front locked in a stalemate, the military leaders on both sides believed the only way to win was to bleed the enemy dry. This led to a series of monstrous battles of attrition, designed to inflict such massive casualties that the other side would be forced to give up. One of the first and most brutal of these was the Battle of Verdun, which began in February 1916. The German plan was to attack the French fortress town of Verdun, a place of huge symbolic importance to France, and in their words, bleed the French army white. They knew the French would defend it to the last man, and they intended to kill them with an overwhelming storm of artillery. The battle raged for 10 months. It was one of the longest and most savage battles in human history. The landscape around Verdun was utterly destroyed, turned into a nightmarish moonscape of craters and shattered trees. The French famously rallied to the cry, "They shall not pass," and managed to hold on, but at a staggering cost. By the time the battle ended in December 1916, the French and Germans had suffered a combined total of over 700,000 casualties. The front line had barely moved. While the French were being bled at Verdun, the British and their Commonwealth allies launched their own major offensive on the River Somme. The attack began on the 1st of July, 1916, and it was a catastrophe. When the British soldiers went over the top, they were met with a hail of machine gun fire. On that single day, the British Army suffered nearly 60,000 casualties, including almost 20,000 killed. It remains the single worst day in the history of the British military. The Battle of the Somme introduced new technologies like the tank, but these were too few and too unreliable to make a decisive impact. By the end of the battle, the Allies had advanced only a few miles, at a cost of over 1 million casualties on all sides. World War I was not just a conflict between armies, it was a total war that involved entire nations. On the home front, life was, well, completely transformed. As millions of men left their jobs to go and fight, governments took unprecedented control over the economy and society. With the men away, women stepped into roles they'd never filled before. Munitions factories making shells and bullets for the front, farms, buses, and trains government offices. A revolutionary shift in society. Life for ordinary people became much harder. Massive shortages of food and essentials. German U-boats threatened to sink merchant ships and starve Britain. Governments introduced rationing, ration books issued to people, sugar, meat, butter, other essential goods, long queues in towns and cities, victory gardens encouraged, poster, save the crumbs, poster, you save a life. Sacrifice demanded from everyone. Governments waged a propaganda war for hearts and minds, posters, newspapers, films. The line between battlefield and home blurred, and everyone was considered part of the national struggle for survival. The war reached into every corner of people's lives. By 1917, the war had been raging for nearly 3 years, and all sides were exhausted. The relentless slaughter had taken a terrible toll, and it seemed there was no end in sight. But two massive events in 1917 would completely change the course of the war. The first was the entry of the United States. For the first few years, America had remained officially neutral, though it had been supplying the Allies with money and goods. President Woodrow Wilson was re-elected in 1916 on the slogan, "He kept us out of war." However, German actions were making it increasingly difficult for the United States to stay on the sidelines. Germany had resumed a policy of unrestricted submarine warfare. This meant their U-boats would sink any ship heading to an Allied port, including those from neutral countries like the United States. The final straw was the Zimmermann telegram, an intercepted secret message from Germany to Mexico. It proposed a military alliance between Germany and Mexico if the United States entered the war, promising Mexico the return of Texas, New Mexico, Arizona. When this was made public, American opinion turned decisively. On 6 April 1917, the United States declared war on Germany. While the Allies gained a powerful new partner, they were about to lose a major one. Russia, which had suffered enormous casualties and was on the brink of collapse, was convulsed by revolution. In March 1917, the Tsar was overthrown. In November 1917, the Bolsheviks, led by Vladimir Lenin, seized power in a second revolution. Lenin had promised the Russian people peace, land, and bread, and he immediately sought to pull Russia out of the war. In March 1918, the new Bolshevik government signed the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk with Germany. With Russia out of the war, the German High Command knew they had one last chance to win. In the spring of 1918, they unleashed massive attacks on the Western Front, the Spring Offensive or Ludendorff Offensive. Using new stormtrooper tactics, specially trained soldiers bypassed strong points and pushed deep into Allied territory. For the first time since 1914, the War of Movement returned. The German armies advanced dozens of miles, pushing the British back, pushing the French back, and once again threatening Paris. It was a desperate, all-or-nothing gamble. For a few terrifying weeks, it looked like it might succeed. However, the German offensive ultimately failed for the same reasons it had in 1914. The attackers became exhausted, their supply lines couldn't keep up. They suffered huge casualties, losing many of their best and most experienced soldiers. Crucially, fresh American troops were now arriving in France at a rate of over 250,000 a month. These doughboys, as they were called, were inexperienced but full of energy, and they plugged the gaps in the Allied line. The German gamble had failed, and their army was spent. The tide had turned for the final time. Beginning in August 1918, the Allies, now reinforced and re-equipped, launched their own series of counter-offensives. Using coordinated attacks with infantry, artillery, tanks, and aircraft, the Allies began to systematically push the German army back. One by one, Germany's allies, Bulgaria, the Ottoman Empire, Austria-Hungary, collapsed and surrendered. Back in Germany, the people were starving due to the British naval blockade, and social unrest was growing. Faced with military defeat and revolution at home, the German Kaiser, Wilhelm II, abdicated and fled to the Netherlands. At 5 a.m. on 11 November 1918, in a railway carriage in the forest of Compiègne, France, representatives of the new German Republic signed an armistice with the Allies. At the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month, the guns on the Western Front finally fell silent. The Great War was over. The end of the fighting in November 1918 was not the end of the story. In January 1919, the leaders met in Paris to decide the terms of the peace. David Lloyd George, Georges Clemenceau, Vittorio Orlando, and Woodrow Wilson. The negotiations were, honestly, pretty difficult. Clemenceau, whose country had been devastated, wanted to crush Germany to ensure it could never threaten France again. Wilson, an idealist, wanted a peace without victory and proposed his 14 points, which included the creation of a League of Nations to prevent future wars. The resulting Treaty of Versailles, signed in June 1919, was largely a compromise that satisfied no one. It imposed incredibly harsh terms on Germany. The infamous War Guilt Clause forced Germany to accept sole responsibility for starting the war. It was stripped of its colonies, its military was severely restricted, and it was ordered to pay enormous financial reparations to the Allies. The Germans felt humiliated and betrayed, believing they had been promised a peace based on Wilson's more lenient 14 points. The war redrew the map of Europe and the Middle East. 4 great empires had vanished. In their place, a host of new countries were created, supposedly based on the principle of national self-determination. The collapse of the Ottoman Empire led to Britain and France taking control of large parts of the Middle East, creating mandates in places like Iraq, Syria, Palestine, the consequences of which are still felt today. The human cost of the war was almost incomprehensible. Around 10 million soldiers were killed and another 20 million were wounded. Millions of civilians also died from disease, starvation, and persecution. The war also ushered in profound social changes. Women in many countries gained the right to vote, partly in recognition of their vital wartime contributions. The First World War was a trauma from which the world never fully recovered, and its legacy would directly lead to the even more destructive Second World War just 2 decades later.